Okay, today we are going to talk about Carl Gustav Jung and everything that I've read by him. I know there's a few major works that I'm missing. I really want to pick up Aeon at some point. I need to read The Psychology of the Unconscious. That's one of the books I actually have that I haven't picked up yet by him. But overall, I think I've read enough of Jung to summarize him, and I will go through every book that I read by him, what I learned, the interesting things that stick with me, and what you can expect, because I think Jung is someone that is very much difficult in a certain sense, but he's very much, once you get past that difficultness, once you get past his very very obscure style, I would say, you can find a lot of value and you can find a lot of depth. And honestly, to me, I think Jung, if you really study him, you have the greatest potential to unlock exactly who it is that you want to be and find out what it is that you have to do to get there. So with that said, the first three books, I want to just say, these are really the starting place that you should go to for Jung. I think if you read these three first, you're going to be well versed to pick up everything else by him. Maybe the red book will challenge you. I think the red book will challenge absolutely everybody. But I think if you read The Undiscovered Self, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and Man and His Symbols, that's really the way that you should start. I wish I did that first because I feel like it would have made it much simpler. I feel like I would have perhaps gained more. But overall, I don't think anything that you start with is going to be bad. It's just, can you get through it? Can you understand it? Can you parse anything from it? That's going to really be the determining factor. And with that said, we'll get into the first book. The first book talks about the undiscovered self. And the undiscovered self is basically talking about the shadow, basically talking about the mask that we all wear to hide ourselves from the world. Think about it like this. When you walk into the world, you don't express every belief you have. You don't say everything on your mind. You don't live up to exactly who you should be. And what this does is it puts a mask over your face to the world. And what's behind that mask is really you, but if it never gets expressed, then it gets built up in the shadow. It gets built up in darkness, and it becomes something that affects you in real time. It becomes something that affects you when you lose your temper. It becomes something that affects you in your habits. It becomes something that pulls you down to the depths of hell, pulls you down into the darkness. And the only way to overcome it is through integration. And this is something that I'll talk about later on, but basically what Jung's overall purpose is if you integrate yourself through art, if you integrate yourself through different things that provide you purpose and meaning and value, then you find yourself, and when you find yourself, you find everything. Jung is really just a mystic disguised as a psychologist, and that's perhaps why I like him so much, but it's probably why he's not read as widely today, because he's a genius of the highest order, but he's also a mystic of the highest order, and that combination is extremely frightening and extremely confusing for a lot of people. The one book, actually, I have one more book to talk about by Jung. It's right here. I just remembered as I'm doing this video. Synchronicity. This book, summarized very quickly, is the idea that your unconscious has access to every single memory, and your unconscious can affect you in subtle ways. So like when you have a gut feeling about something, when you have a dream about something, when you have a premonition about something, what it is your mind is basically a supercomputer, and if it has access to everything, it can make insane predictions that seem too good to be true, that seem like they're out of no place. But it's the precognitive abilities of the unconscious that allow for these deja vu feelings, for these epiphanies, for these synchronistic events where we talk about someone and then the next day they call us on the phone. Like, that's what that is. It's your brain's ability to your brain's ability for precognition. I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't say that word. But the next thing we have is Memories, Dreams, Reflections. This is Jung's autobiography. Actually, it's not really an autobiography. In certain places, it's written purely by Jung. In other places, it's written by, I think, what's her name? Anila Jaffe. I think that's how you say it. Sorry if I said it wrong. Sorry. I don't know if she's still alive. She probably isn't. But if you're her descendants, I'm sorry. I know I said it wrong. But basically, this book started out as a biography, and basically Jung at some point was like, you know what, I want to write this section myself. So it's half biography, half autobiography. And what's interesting about this book is it's Jung analyzing himself. It's Jung understanding his own dreams. It's Jung applying his analysis to himself, which is what made him the greatest psychologist ever. Sigmund Freud was the father of psychoanalysis, but never psychoanalyzed himself. So he would always project his own insecurities. He would always project his own weaknesses onto other people. This is why Freud basically believed everything was sexual, because Freud had unresolved sexuality. And not to say that there's not something to that. I think there's a lot of people that have distorted versions of sexuality inside their heads, and it affects them in other ways. But I think Jung speaks to the much deeper and the much more profound elements of the soul that Freud quite couldn't get to because he couldn't quite observe his own faults. It also has stories of Freud and Jung in this that are just hysterical, but I'll let you guys read that for yourself. The one that I remember is that basically this woman was having like schizophrenic ramblings, and Jung was able to deduce that what she was really doing is it was her unconscious speaking out in symbolic manner so that the conscious mind could not perceive it. And basically Jung theorized that if he could get the conscious to recognize the unconscious, then she could be cured of her schizophrenia. And he brings this theory to Freud, and Freud goes, "That's an interesting theory, but do you really want to spend so much time with such an ugly woman?" And I read that and I was like, it's just so cold-hearted, but it's just so funny to think that Freud was saying things like that. But anyway, on to Man and His Symbols. Man and His Symbols is perhaps the greatest book if you're only going to read one book on Jung. The reason I say this is because it's basically his ideas summarized in the most easy way. It's basically his ideas meant for the wider audience. The books I have right here, all of these works, as well as all the other collected work series, are not really meant for a wide audience. They're not really meant for an average reader. They're meant for a scientific mind and someone that's going to be in clinical practice. So I think just the difference in audience makes it more approachable for someone that's not familiar with Jung. But basically, Man and His Symbols is going to lay out all of his ideas, and it's not just written by Jung. Jung is a genius of the highest order, like I said earlier, and he is someone that is so smart that sometimes he says something that he thinks is simple and you don't get the reference, you don't get what he's talking about, so sometimes it's difficult. But Man and His Symbols is written in part by Jung and in part by his students, and basically I think it's the best of both worlds because you get a dumbed down version of it, but you get a dumbed down version from people that are dumber than Jung, so it's not as elevate. Like sometimes I try to explain things, like sometimes I try to explain philosophy or literature or things that to people that have absolutely no basis, that have never really studied the subject, and it's like I feel like I'm speaking in a different language. And this is kind of what it is reading Jung sometimes, whereas his students are much more down to earth, much more capable of expressing themselves in a more reasonable way. But with that said, we'll get into the next book. The next book is the Red Book. If you think Man and His Symbols is easy, then get ready for the Red Book, because the Red Book is... Jung described it himself as basically, to the outside observer, this will seem like insanity, but to me, it was responsible for all my sanity and all my success. And basically what the Red Book is Jung's journey of active imagination after him and Freud basically split ways. Freud was basically grooming Jung to be the successor to Freudian theories and Freudian psychosexual theory, and basically was going to give him like a golden ticket to have all the money he wanted, all the prestige he wanted. But Jung wrote the Psychology of the Unconscious. I think that's what it was called originally. There's been a million different versions of the book. It's been re-edited, it's been re-released, and all these different things. It's not that important. But basically what Jung did is he spoke out against some of Freud's theories. Freud was very upset and basically ostracized Jung from the whole community. And basically overnight, Jung lost all his credibility. He basically lost all his political pull and all of his friends, and started to go through a mental breakthrough. And through the course of 5 years, he basically retreated into himself, retreated into his unconscious, and had to deal with the demons so that he could become the best doctor he could be. And in this is pure Gnosticism, pure mystic writings and symbolic occult symbols, and it doesn't read like Jung, it reads like Crowley. If you've ever read Crowley, I don't know if anyone has, I don't know if anyone will, I don't know if anyone wants to. I mean, it's certainly weird, it's certainly out there, but Basically, if you can parse anything from this book, you'll gain a lot of insights, but it's super, super interesting to see Jung contact his anima, to see Jung talk to these entities that are a figment of his own unconscious, and how they communicate to him, and how they relate to him. But overall, what I learned from that book was Jung had to go to the depths of hell to confront his shadow and bring it to the light, because there's no such thing as light without dark. And if you think you're living in the light, then you're really living in the dark as well, because it's the integration of the darkness with the light that allows you to walk the middle path. But if you're up here, you're subject to the Luciferian ideas. I know I'm getting into Masonic ideas right now, but basically, think of the utilitarians. Think of the government officials that, they'll say, well, we have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. Well, we have to do this for the greater good. Well, it's the Machiavellian idea of like the state before everything. Like, who cares if a few people are hung out to dry if we get our goal in the end? And that's really what Jung is warning against, and that's really what I feel like I've heard Jordan Peterson say this as well. Like, intelligence can lead to evil because it means that you have more power, you have more control of your mind, you have more control of the world, and you can lose a part of your humanity if you go too far in one direction. That's basically what Jung is talking about, and I think it's a super, super interesting book. Maybe don't read it right away. Maybe save that for later writings. I think I really only understood it because I read this book. We'll talk about this book next, but if you don't know occult symbols, if you don't really know that side of things, if you're not into Western esoteric ideas and beliefs, I don't think you're really going to grasp that much from it, but it's certainly something that you can challenge yourself with, you can pick up. I'm sure if you do research while you're doing it, you can, parse something from it, but I would say hold off on that book until you're much more into Jung and much more into his symbols, because it'll make a lot more sense, because the things that he talks about in his other books recur in the red book, and it'll just click a lot better. So the next thing we have is Psychology and Alchemy. Basically what this book is about is the allegory of alchemy. So to most people, they think alchemy is the transmutation of lead into gold, but in fact it was a allegory to prevent the church from prosecuting the alchemists who were in pursuit of the perfection of the soul. And I mean, the real end goal of alchemy was the philosopher's stone. Whether you think this is symbolic, whether you think this is purely metaphorical, I mean, it's up to your interpretation. I would say it's probably a little bit of both, but again, that's my Robert Anton Wilson influence coming out. But basically, what this book talks about is that there's these ancient, some people call it a cult, but they're just ancient symbols that recur throughout history, that recur throughout time, that indicate certain aspects of transformation, that indicate certain stages of transformation. And basically, in this book, Jung tracked those symbols through his patient's progress and through his patient's dreams, and really just explained how these things occur and reoccur and are symbols and signs of things that are to come. And it's super interesting. It's super weird. It ties together a lot of kind of obscure symbols, obscure history, more esoteric sort of schools and wisdom. And I think it's super cool because it's, most of the time when you talk about occult stuff, like, people go really into the weeds of things and go like, well, there's this cabal and this and that. But like, symbols convey meaning, symbols convey messaging, and when you get to the root of what the symbols we're talking about, I think there's a lot of interesting metaphors and discussions, and you can really parse through if you understand what these symbols are trying to indicate. And I think it's just overall a cool book. I don't know if it's one of the more informative books that you'll read by Jung, but it's certainly something that you'll read and you'll gain a whole new appreciation for Jung as a scholar and as a mystic, I guess we would say. I don't really know how else to describe him, but the last thing we have is the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. And I think if you're going to read any one of these collected works, I think this is the one to read. Super interesting book. Talks about a whole lot of subjects. Talks about the Joker, or the trickster archetype, he calls it. He talks about the hero archetype. Talks about the anima animus. Basically, what Jung defines as archetypes are these images that we see in our mind that we shoot for, that we more or less strive to become. So like, everyone has their perception of hero. Like you can go all across the world and everyone has their own perception of the hero, but the image might be a little different. They might look different, they might have different skin colors depending on what part of the world they are, but like overall they're going to have somewhat the same qualities. They're going to have the idea of heroism. They're going to have the idea of facing a trial, failing, triumphing, and then, returning to the land a hero. Like that's really what happens everywhere. And basically you can see the decay of archetypes in our modern world and see the decay of society. So like, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to go out into the world and do something? Like we don't have the same rites of passage. We don't have the same trials and tribulations. We don't have the hero's journey, and that's why so many men today are lost. Like I think Fight Club spoke to it best out of any other work. It's so weird because like I know Fight Club's a very deep book, but you wouldn't think like even in the movie to include it. But there's that one scene where Brad Pitt basically goes, "We're the lost generation. We didn't have any great war. We didn't have any great unifying thing that brought us all together, and because of that, we're all lost." And that's really what we see in the modern world. And it's not just for men; it's for women as well. I think there's a big change up. I think the internet. I think society. I think all the things that used to be necessary to survive aren't there anymore, and we're really in the struggle to come up with the answer to now what? Now what do we do? Now what do we do? How do we find meaning? How do we find purpose? Because the original purpose to life was to find, the sustenance for life. But now that we have that, what do we do? And it's a really interesting question. But anyway, back to the archetypes. But what the archetypes really are the Platonic ideal of forms. I feel like I talk about this a lot, but if you're unfamiliar with that idea, basically the Platonic idea of forms is that things are more than they appear. Things are more than we perceive, and what we perceive is only a mere limitation of our tools of observation. And basically, this is what we shoot for. This is what we project onto our partner. This is what we project onto the people in our lives. And they can never quite live up to these perfect images we have of them, and this is what leads to a lot of disappointment. But at the same time, it's what leads to our disappointment as well. Because I mean, think of the conqueror, think of the politician. Like they want to be this great savior, they want to be this great hero, but they can never quite live up to that image. And it's the archetypes and the symbols that control us that really control the world. And you can tell a lot about the state of a civilization by telling, by looking at their art, simply because the art conveys meaning, the art conveys what we value. And I don't think art's ever been at a lower place, but here we are to change that. Here we are as the next generation of artists to create a whole new world. But that is everything that I've read by Jung. I feel like I could have gone into more detail about a bunch of things. I certainly didn't go into enough detail about the anima animus. I didn't quite explain the unconscious. I didn't explain the personal unconscious or the collective unconscious, but I think I did enough to get you interested. I think I did enough to start your process of learning and reading. And again, Jung is someone that the more you think about, the more it makes sense. But you might not make sense of it as you're reading it, but you'll definitely make sense of it when you start to ponder, when you start to analyze your dreams, when you start to see the same symbols recurring and the same patterns recurring throughout yourself and throughout other people. And it's really through the introspection that Jung has taught me that I feel like I've learned the most about myself. And, I'm eternally grateful for Carl Gustav Jung. But with that said, one of my favorite authors, someone you're definitely required to study if you watch my channel. I think anything I say is reductive compared to Jung, and I think there's a lot more transformation that you can get through his writings versus my writings. But one day I'll get there. But yeah, I love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate the support on the channel. It's awesome to see. It's awesome to see that people want to hear me talk about the things I like to talk about. People want to hear me talk about books. A few years ago I couldn't even read a book, and now people are coming to me for my suggestions. So it's cool. It's really cool, and it just goes to show what you can do if you really dedicate yourself to a passion, what you can really do if you dedicate time to something that really means something to you. And I think it's never been a better time to get obsessed with a hobby and try to share that with the world, because now we're in the day and age where you can make a living off that. Now we're in a day and age where that can become your career. So use this as an example. Use this as your inspiration. Use this as your sign to just go. I know we were talking about synchronicities. This is the synchronicity. This is the time. But with that said, if you want to read my writings, go ahead, join my school community. If you don't, then cool, you can stay on the channel. I'm not upset. I'm not crying. I don't need your validation on my writings. But yeah, I love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.